Welcome everybody to another virtual workshop hosted by the Albright Institute. Today we are hosting and celebrating a discussion of this book, which was just published this year, Jerusalem II, Jerusalem in Roman and Byzantine Times, edited by Katharina Heyden and Maria Lissek. Today we have with us the two editors who will be presenting a little bit about the project and how it came about and what you can expect from the book itself. We then have three of the contributors here who will talk a little bit about the work that they contributed to the volume. And finally, we have two outside reviewers who will talk about the book from their point of view. At the end of that session, those prepared remarks, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature. I will not be monitoring the chat, just the Q&A feature. You'll find it in the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will also be posting in the chat, because you'll be monitoring it, some links to ways that you can contribute to the Albright Institute and for further information about both the book as well as the Institute itself. So without further ado, I would like to invite Katharina Heyden and Maria Lissek to talk about their book project.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm the second editor, but I have the pleasure to start this book launch. Jerusalem, aka Elia Capitolina, Hierosolyma, Al-Quds. Different names for one city. Pagans, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, variety of human beings and believers of different denominations, as well as religions, living and worship city. Emperors, bishops, and monks, different claims on and interests in a city. This three-part panorama is the structure of the volume about Jerusalem in Roman-Byzantine Times. The volume that was published this summer, the volume that Katharina and I worked on with authors from different parts of the world, subjects and disciplinary approaches. The volume that is published under the name Jerusalem II, and that is part of the series Comes at publishing house Mohr Siebeck, Tübingen in Germany. And it is this volume that lies in the center of this book launch and our discussion this evening. A very warm welcome also from my side to everybody joining this book launch. The series Comes, short for Civitatum Orbis Mediterraneae Studia, publishes volumes that, and I quote, deal with a significant place in the Mediterranean area in antiquity in an interdisciplinary approach. Each volume is thought as a compendium, which in its overviews and its specialized individual articles incorporates each of the facets which account for the uniqueness of the place. End of quote. Our volume presents the uniqueness of Jerusalem from 2nd to 7th century. The volume Jerusalem I that is planned will cover and present the uniqueness of Jerusalem before this time. All along Jerusalem is, and this is our most likely everyone of you knows, a city like no others. As our introduction to the volume starts, Jerusalem is a city like no other. Hardly any other city is so strongly influenced by religious history as Jerusalem. To this day, Jews, Christians, and Muslims associate this place with memories of events that lead to the origins of their religious communities and has shaped their identity over centuries. Pagans, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they all had or have their own Jerusalem that led to different and competing claims on the city. Many of these traces date back to the first centuries of our era, when first the pagan Romans and then the Christian Byzantines, and finally in the 7th century, the Islamic Arabs ruled over the former Jewish capital. As is well known, this made the history of Jerusalem complex, multi-layered, and multifaceted. And that is why this volume focuses on and emphasizes the inter. Hence, the first part explores how the city and its topography and buildings was shaped between the interests of religious and political leaders as well as believers. The interfocus in part 2 throws light on the economical and religious interaction between city and surrounding. And part 3 gives insights about claims and demands on the city by political and clerical authorities. Last but definitely not least, The volume ends with two approaches how Jerusalem was perceived in early Islamic period. This is a special approach we chose, as we think it is the appropriate way to encounter a city and its history like Jerusalem. A city like no other, therefore, needs an approach not necessarily like no other, but certainly an approach that portrays the complexity and multidimensional nature of Jerusalem in Roman-Byzantine times. I hand over to Katharina, who will present you this basic concept now in detail.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the invitation to present our book with the Albright Institute. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here this evening. Long, long ago, in a time that seems to go back much longer than our common way of counting years would suggest, that is to say, before the pandemic, we gathered 19 experts on late antique Jerusalem in the medieval castle of Münchenwiler in Switzerland, and we discussed the draft chapters of this present volume in person. I still remember that access to the internet was an issue in some of the rooms in this remote time and place, and so we had hardly any distractions and could intensively discuss questions such as, what should and could a handbook on Jerusalem achieve, given the fact that so many books were already written about this city, while at the same time, new archaeological findings continue to enrich, but also to challenge our state of knowledge? How can this handbook-like collective volume made as useful for students as well as interesting for researchers in the various fields? What can be considered to be established archaeological knowledge about Jerusalem? Which questions need to be asked anew, and how can the perspectives of different academic disciplines and cultures complement and enrich each other? As a result of these discussions, this volume is a bit different from other volumes in the Coma series. It is not structured in the way that each chapter is dedicated to one individual ethnic or religious group. We were rather looking for an approach in which the city itself is at the center. The city in its physical shape, the city as a living space, and the city as an object of claims. I assume that all of you are excited to listen to our contributors and the external experts, and therefore I will be very brief in presenting you the most important aspects of the book from the editor's point of view. And I will do so by counting down from 4 to 1. Number 4. The book consists of 4 major parts. 3 of them are actually called parts in the table of contents, and they cover the Roman-Byzantine times, namely the 2nd to 7th centuries. These 3 parts reflect the 3 aspects that were already mentioned by Maria, and that to us seem to be crucial for every understanding of a city as an urban space. First, the topographic and the architectonic shape of a city. Second, the concrete life of different ethnic and religious groups within a city. And third, the political and religious claims that were made on the city by various authorities and groups. The 4th part is dedicated to the question when and to what extent the Muslim conquest began to really impact Jerusalem's shape and life. And we hope it's needless to say that the title of this part, which is Epilogue, does not imply any idea of the city's decline caused by Islamic rule. The 2 chapters by Angelika Neuwirth and Boaz Shoshan do rather show that there was much more urban continuity than a real break in the 7th and 8th centuries. Number 3. When inviting colleagues from different academic disciplines to contribute to this volume, we asked them to bear in mind 3 leading cross questions in order to foster the interdisciplinary attempt of the project. Wherever it seemed useful to them, authors were invited to address first the tension and relation between continuity and discontinuity in the shape, the life, and the claims of the city. Second, the interrelation and interplay between the city and its rural surroundings. And third, the interplay between the physical or real and the imagined city of Jerusalem. We do think that these 3 aspects indicate also to what extent the city of Elia, Jerusalem, is on the one hand paradigmatic for any late antique Mediterranean city, and on the other hand, very exceptional, if not unique. The first question, that of continuity and discontinuity, is to be raised for every city in late antiquity. The third aspect is specifically important with Jerusalem, because the city, as hardly any other, seems to exist in 2 different and still related realities. The second aspect, that of the interplay between the urban area and its more rural hinterland, is a bit in the middle, as it can be applied to some other metropoles such as Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antiochia, but not simply to any city in the same way. In our introduction, Maria and I tried to systematize a bit those 3 cross questions and to bring the different and not always concordant answers that are given in the single book chapters into a constructive dialogue. Number 2 brings me to the gaps that I really feel with regard to the book and that I think are important to mention as well. These gaps have arisen for reasons that I will not explain here in detail, but which to my impression also say something about the state and the challenges of current research in the field. The first gap is that we do not have an own chapter on the epigraphic evidence and all the rich insights that epigraphic evidence could provide about the composition of the city's population. We are all the more thankful that John Seligman in his chapter on economics referred to epigraphic evidence as well. The second gap is that the book does not provide a comprehensive and systematic contribution to what we call Oriental or Eastern Christians. This chapter, unfortunately, was never finished and could not substitute it in time. It is the hope of vivid ongoing research in this field and its future outputs that comforts me a little over this gap. And the number 1. Finally, by counting down to number 1, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the volume provides one single unified bibliography. We discussed this with the authors, and some of them would probably have preferred single reference lists. But in order to make the volume as consistent and user-friendly as possible, we eventually decided to compose a unique shared bibliography. The 70-page bibliography certainly does not offer a complete bibliography on Jerusalem in Roman-Byzantine times, which is impossible, I guess. But we hope that it does provide at least a representative overview on relevant primary sources and research literature. The same aim is behind the 3 maps that at the very end of the volume, which were created by Siegfried Ostermann, also in dialogue with the authors. Also here, we try to unify the crowd intelligence and knowledge of all contributions and make it visible. As editors, Maria and I would like to say a special thank to all of our authors that they have engaged in this type of close cooperation and common knowledge production. And with that, I have counted down from 4 to 0, and I'm happy to hand over to Christoph Markschies, who speaks to us from Berlin as our first contributor.
Many greetings in Jerusalem's and Berlin's and other evenings, and greetings to the High Noon in Chicago, and best wishes from Berlin to all the places where people are watching this seminar. What I'm doing is to present my own article because I was asked to do so, and I think I should do exactly the opposite what Katharina did, counting from 1 to 4, so that no one will sleep away in the evening. The title of my contribution was given to me to the editors, and the title given to me to the editors was The Christianization of Jerusalem and Their Impulse to the Urbanization. So two heavily disputed terms in last decades research, Christianization and urbanization, were included. And so I apologize for a very typical German approach discussing those terms. But before I did this, discussing the terms Christianization and urbanization, I began with something, how to say, to disturb our image, what we have in mind when thinking of the relation between Christianization and urbanization. And this is, I think, certain images like the well-known Madaba map. And I said, when analyzing the Madaba map, you got the impression that there is not only, as we normally look when looking to the term Christianization, one center, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but there is also this wonderful pillar in front of St. Stephen's Gate, which is not related to Christianization, but is a sign that this city is not a fully Christianized city, but is a city where certain layers were laid above each other. And the image the city was presenting in late antiquity was depending of the people approaching to the city. The interest they were looking for, the buildings they were looking for. And so the first approach was, it was depending, and it is depending from the way we are coming nearby to the city and looking to the city and walking through the city. That's the introduction. And then, as I addressed at the beginning, I'm discussing the problems of Christianization and urbanization. When looking to the last decade discussion on Christianization, it's quite clear that we have to avoid to use this as an umbrella term for discussing archaeological evidence, to discuss evidence from texts, to discuss personal piety of people, group identities, and the extremely difficult question, what is the grade of Christianization of certain archaeological evidences. There is the wonderful discussion on the so-called Jewish Christian elements in the archaeological findings, and it's quite clear that there is nearly nothing in that what proves them as Jewish Christian. So what we have to do, and I think Jan Willem Drivers is with us, he perfectly distinguished between certain aspects of Christianization, and for certain questions which we have to the grade or the depth of Christianization, we have no sources. So the question is how we can use the evidence, and that's discussed. And then I'm analyzing the wonderful how to say, model of Christianization in Harnack's history of mission, which he completed in 1924, where surprisingly, or in fact not surprisingly, Christianization is modeled according to the classical 19th century idea, first Jewish Christian, then pagan Christian, and the whole development is arranged to a master narrative, which we have serious problems to identify in the sources and archaeological evidences today. And also the idea that Christianization is like filling a cup of tea, and that the whole model of Christianization is this cup of tea filling model. Then I discussed the idea of urbanization, especially in discussing a wonderful series of articles by the Cologne ancient historian Friedrich Vietinghoff, and trying to distinguish the difference between an urbanization from outside and urbanization from within the city, and setting up certain paradigms of urbanization in the Mediterranean in late antiquity. And after having discussed these two terms, I was asking the question how these two are related: the Christianization of certain fields, of certain sources and evidences, and the urbanization. And then I was discussing that with the question of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and presenting the idea that there are different possibilities to discuss this building. Seen from the viewpoint of urbanization, it's something which is related to loyalty. A city building up a building financed in parts by the emperor is demonstrating loyalty, which is in no way something specific Christianized or Christian, but is something which is in the core of the, how to say, establishing political and social cohesion in the Roman Empire. And on the other side, we are often extremely how to say, engaged in setting up certain meanings in building processes. For example, the idea that the councils of ancient Christianity are visible in a certain building program, or in the ways buildings were erected in Jerusalem. And my impression is that's a kind of putting after the event sense in a building. And then at the end, I was trying to set up that there is also a impossibility for certain places in the city to link Christianization and urbanization. And the last paragraph, the fourth in my chapter, is the Temple Mount as a kind of non-city in the city. So the Christianization was at a certain point came to an end at the most highest point of the city. That's a kind of wasted land in the center of the city, and that made quite clear that the idea that Christianization is something which was characterizing the whole city is a misleading idea. Certain parts were Christianized, others not, and there is always the question how fractionized Christianity in the city was, how the ethnic groups were dividing Christianity. But I think that's for the moment enough to mention some aspects of the article. I tried to include also new archaeological excavations, especially the Mount Zion excavations by the German Protestant Institute, so to to a certain extent, avoid the idea that there was a concrete planning of Christianization of the city, which brought the idea of a fully Christianized city to a certain point into the mind of ancient visitors and us visiting the city in today's research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph Markschies, also for providing a short English version of your contribution that is actually published in German here, so that's very useful. And I would like to hand over to Nichole Belayche, whose article is part of the second part, The Religious Life at Aelia Capitolina, ex-Jerusalem in Roman Times.
Thank you very much. So from Christianization to the pagan Aelia Capitolina, it's a real pleasure to present two brief survey of the three main issues related to the religious life in Jerusalem after it was turned into the Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina from around 130 to the Christianization in the 4th century, about which Christoph just talked. These 2 centuries, when pagans peopled the city in the majority, attracted less scholarly attention than the Jewish or Christian Jerusalem indeed, up to recently, when archaeologists brought refreshing data on the Roman, thus pagan Aelia Capitolina, and you have on the screen one of the recent publication on that new information. Roman soldiers who have been garrisoned in Jerusalem from the end of the first revolt on, when Jews have been expelled from the city. This demographic change, attested also by textual evidence like Cassius Dio on the screen, was a first step for a religious change. It was enhanced under the Emperor Hadrian when the Roman colonia was founded, thus a pagan population settled. The name of the colony, Aelia Capitolina, paid tribute to the names of both the emperor and the Roman national god Jupiter. Sorry. The colonial status is decisive for reconstructing the juridical frame of the local religious life, like the calendar, the basic priesthoods, and very few deities to be honored, the Capitoline triad with Ludi, Venus, and the dei Penates. Apart from these requirements, the colony was free for setting the contents of its religious life, that is, other worshipped deities, places, buildings, and so on. In consequence, the Capitoline triad was probably honored, or Jupiter alone more plausibly. The point is actually debatable because the triad is figured only once on this coin issued at the beginning of the colony under Hadrian. Later on, Jupiter is depicted alone, and this matches information given by literary evidence as well. Concerning the other deities honored in Aelia Capitolina, Greek and Roman mainly, two deserve more attention for enlightening the cross-cultural interactions in the religious life of the colony. Firstly, Tyche, on the right of the screen. She bears the Greek name of the divine fortune, yet in the Near East, she is a mix of the Hellenistic model built in the Syrian Antioch and the Syrian goddess Astarte. Her strong presence in Aelia Capitolina demonstrates that the new Roman population of the colony appropriated rapidly the major religious trends of the region, with no reminder of the Jewish identity of the former Jerusalem. Yet in this city, the Greco-Eastern Tyche assumed also features of Venus Aphrodite, on the basis of two combined processes: a traditional Eastern link between Aphrodite, Urania, and Astarte, clearly identified in Ascalon and Delos, and a Roman link between Aphrodite and Venus, passing through either the law of the colony or the contemporary politics of Hadrian in Rome, who inaugurated the Temple of Venus and Rome at the entrance of the Forum Romanum. For Christian polemical texts, which put an emphasis mainly on her, she provided a convenient figure as a, quote, wicked pagan demon, to use their words. A second deity illustrates that the local pantheon of the colony was in line with that of other Levantine cities. Serapis was a Greco-Alexandrian god by origin, who entered with his female partner Isis in the public Roman pantheon in 70 CE, right when Vespasian and Titus celebrated their triumph over Judea at the end of the First Revolt. The inscription on the screen gives a clue to the appropriation of the god by the Romans, who was even granted with the name of the national god Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Many of the veterans who were allotted in Aelia Capitolina had sojourned in Egypt and brought with them the worship of this great and propitious deity. Moreover, Serapis was known as a therapeutic god, and he could have been settled in one of the traditional curative places in Jerusalem, namely a place to the north of the city, designated as the probatic tool in the probatic pool, in the Gospels. Thus, the place cut across religious affiliations after its use for providing water for cleaning the Jewish temple and its reputation for Jesus' miracles. This leads to my last point, which is the more debated among scholars today. Position of scholars differ when they examine the location of cult places because of the lack of clear archaeological data within a religion-urban context that was highly troubled along history. Textual evidence of these cult places is confusing up to contradictory, or it is ideologically built by Christian authors whose purpose was to write a glorious narrative of the triumph of the church. Therefore, their testimony cannot be used straightforward, as regularly for textual evidence, so cannot be used straightforward for both Jewish and pagan realities of the time. Three locations mainly raised debates. The first one, the therapeutic sanctuary outside the city limits to the north, is the less problematic. For excavations discovered some structures and ex votos. Yet, its topographical setting remains tricky, as its divine owner for some scholars, and you may note that the tentative plan that I propose to you is somehow different than the first map of the book. I think there is sufficient ground for asserting a cult place of Serapis and not of Asclepios, as imagined possibly in the book. The two other places are more problematic. However, they are a key issue for both the religious reconstruction of Aelia Capitolina and the understanding of the Roman policy in the former Jerusalem, insofar as they concern the temple of Jupiter. Very little is known on the destiny of the Temple Mount, and it could not be properly excavated, as you know. Texts like that of Cassius Dio on the right are too ambiguous for locating the Jupiter temple on the Temple Mount with certainty, the more so because all the other texts, admittedly Christian ones, but by contemporary witnesses, mention only statues of the emperors and an area devoted to agricultural farming. My conviction, shouldered on a range of arguments detailed in my paper, but I do not have time to detail them now, is that the Jupiter temple has been built at the center of the colonial grid on the north side of the forum, where a Capitoline temple is expected in a Roman urban center. It was a high place, the Golgotha Hill, needed to be leveled in order to receive the platform for a temple, as narrated by Eusebius on the left of the screen. The coincidence with the location of both the crucifixion and Jesus' tomb raised a Christian ideological narrative in which the temple of Jupiter disappears and leaves the place to, I quote Eusebius, a gloomy sanctuary to the impure demon of Aphrodite. Admittedly, a shrine of Aphrodite Tuke, the city goddess, could plausibly be housed within the large temenos of Jupiter facing the Temple Mount. As you see, the religious Aelia Capitolina has still many uncertainty aspects, and time was too short to argue on them. Yet it is sure, in my opinion, that the local religious life was not different from that of other Roman cities of the Levant, including new religious trends like the glorification of a solid god, and of course, magic practices when risks of life are at stake. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nichole. And I would like to hand over now to Ora Limor in Jerusalem. Or is it Jerusalem? Is it right? It's
Leider in Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv. Who provided, I think, for the first time, a really comparative chapter on Jewish and Christian pilgrimage in Jerusalem. Please, Ora.
Good evening to everybody. And first, I would like to thank Katharina Heyden and Maria Lissek for inviting me to contribute to the volume on Jerusalem in Roman-Byzantine Times. This impressive book approaches Jerusalem from many interesting angles, as you have heard, and is quite comprehensive in scope. It benefits greatly from the rich research that has been done on this intriguing period in the past decades. We can say with confidence and pride that late antiquity has been at the forefront of historical research, and that it has stimulated many new questions and delineated new and fresh paths of thinking about the past. Every chapter in the book we are celebrating today opens a window to this fascinating time in the city of Jerusalem. And as we all know, as Jerusalem is considered the center of the world, the omphalos and the axis mundi, research about her always has fundamental implications for the period as a whole. My own theme, pilgrimage, is such a case. Pilgrims came to Jerusalem from near and far. They brought with them their languages, cultures, customs, and ideas, and thus made Jerusalem, despite her peripheral geographic location in relation to Rome or Constantinople in any case, they made her a hub of cultural encounters. These pilgrims, those who did not stay in the Holy Land for life like Jerome, Paula, or the two Melanias, And those who did not die on the way, like one of the friends of the Piacenza pilgrim, brought home with them things they learned in Jerusalem and things they received or purchased there. Religious teachings, liturgical prescriptions, geographical information, relics, souvenirs, and memories. Some of the pilgrims put these memories into writing, and over time, these writings formed a distinct body of literature known as itineraria. The itineraria, comprised of travel narratives and Holy Land descriptions, is a treasure trove of information about the Holy Land in general and about Jerusalem in particular. And although the itineraria is sometimes considered a dull genre because all of its works relate to the same places, and thus, as someone told me once, you read one, you read them all, I see just the opposite in these accounts. Each pilgrim and each writer has a voice. It is our task and our duty to uncover the individual voices behind the descriptions of places and traditions. The vital, enthusiastic Egeria, the serious and gloomy Paula, the curious collector Piacenza pilgrim, the resourceful Willibald later, beginning of the 8th century, and others in the years to come. These are all the mediators, the go-betweens, who help to bring together the different parts of the Christian universe. I've worked on holy places, pilgrimage, and travel narratives for many years. But in the article I wrote for the volume we celebrate today, I try to look at these topics from an even broader point of view, and Katharina has mentioned it already, to ask fundamental questions about the pilgrimage phenomenon and to relate in my answers both to the Christian world and the Jewish one, the two religious cultures for whom Jerusalem was sacred at the time. The task was not easy, not just because of the extreme differences in political power and position of Christians and Jews at the time, but also, and mainly, because of the deep difference in the data we have in our possession about the two groups. There are no genres similar to the itineraria in the Jewish world of late antiquity, and the Jewish sources hardly relate to pilgrimage to Jerusalem, or they are so vague as to hamper our ability to draw historical information from them. Several Christian sources do relate to Jewish pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but they are few in number and written in a polemical vein meant to deliver a theological anti-Jewish message. Yet, despite the deep disparity, I still believe that gazing from both sides of the fence was worth the effort. Not only because it is always important and fair to look both at majority and minority in order to gain a fuller picture of the past and aim the volume in its entirety achieves in a very admirable way, but also because pilgrimage is a useful prism. And not just for questions of majority and minority and religious differences, but also for questions of cultural differences between East and West, for questions of reception and influence, and also for questions related to gender, such as the presence of women in our period, both as pilgrims and as heroines of pilgrimage literature. Such a prism tells us much about the place of women in early Christianity and in the late Roman Empire, and it calls for comparisons with other societies, cultures, and with other periods in history. So this is what I try to achieve, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ora. And thank you, all the three of you, for presenting us your chapters. And we are especially happy and grateful that we could also include two let's say, neutral experts from the field of ancient history, because of course, the best way of celebrating a new book, a newborn book, is to include also neutral or even critical views on that book. So we are excited about your presence here. Clifford Ando from the University of Chicago and Konstantin Klein from the University in Bamberg in Germany. And I would like to hand over to Clifford Ando for your neutral or critical, or I don't know, what a review of this book.
No, thank you very much. First of all, my thanks for the invitation. It was it's a busy fall, but it was really a pleasure to try and come to grips with this book. It combines, I think, really wonderful detail with extended coverage as regards both theme and time, so that, you know, although there are, as in fact Nichole displayed via slide, there are other works out there, including very recent work, that tell us things about the, as it were, the architectural changes and the changes in monumentalization in Jerusalem. To have this combined with chapters on water, on the demography of the rural area and the economy of the rural area, and you know, other discussions about, as it were, something like the integration of monastic institutions into the structures of city, state, and provincial public and religious authority, was really great to have all of these perspectives combined between two covers, as it were. And I can only hope that, although a great deal of academic reading is instrumental, people find the chapters they want via academia or something like this. I can only hope that people will, some people will attempt to read, you know, the great bulk of the book. You know, I'm not an expert on Jerusalem, so what I want to do today is to try and situate some things that the book does, and some things that and some aspects of the history of Jerusalem in some wider history of the transformation of city-states in the Roman world. And I suppose this is in some level in keeping with an interest of mine in how we talk about something like the emergence of Jewish law in the High Roman Empire. I am on the side of those who think that something like rabbinic law, to use a kind of umbrella term, that a rabbinic law is nothing less, but also nothing more than something like the second best attested system of provincial law in the Roman world. Probably the best attested case, but it's differently attested, is that of Egypt, which is not to say that one can't say distinctive things, as it were, about the rabbis. They have a different social position than something like the specialists on law who emerge in something like all other provinces at exactly the same time. The emergence of specialists on law in the provinces, something like across all provinces in the later second century, is an interesting phenomenon, and relatively little remarked. The relationship, chronological and otherwise, relationship between the emergence of rabbinic law and the emergence of legal specialists elsewhere is not much remarked on, but deserves some emphasis. In that sense, my focus on law, and then what I'm going to say in a moment, is very much in keeping with the assertion that Nichole Belayche just made when she described religious developments as, quote unquote, being in line with those that are visible elsewhere in Syria and Palestina. So for all that it's a relatively late instance of this phenomenon, of course, many other cities or city-states of the ancient world were transformed into Roman colonies, and this was done de novo. And likewise, the transformation of cities in late antiquity, the gradual, quote unquote, Christianization of cities in late antiquity, is something that many other places underwent. This includes actually, I was going to talk about leveling, but it's already been mentioned. This includes the process of leveling. After all, something like 300,000 cubic meters of rock were moved to make a level space at the center of the former city of Carthage. And we know a great deal, not simply archaeologically, but also from literary sources, about the gradual emergence of an orthogonal grid, or at least enough of an orthogonal grid to make Empúries in Spain legible as a Roman city. This was sort of done in interesting stages, first in respect of the indigenous portion, and then in respect of the Greek, what you could call the Greek ghetto or the Greek city. It has there's a kind of interesting set of explanations given to us in antiquity why the Greek population of Empúries remained siloed in its own neighborhood. Likewise, there are many cities in the eastern provinces of the empire in which what was a Greek agora, by which I mean a Greek style agora, with a particular distribution of public spaces, a particular relationship of the situation of religious monuments to public, to, as it were, sites for the exercise of public authority and so forth. There are many, many eastern cities in which the agora became something like a Roman forum. And by this, of course, I mean not a Roman forum of the Republic, but a Roman forum of the empire, since the various fora in the city of Rome of the imperial period were very different beasts than they had been under the Republic. It's not simply that they were monumentalized and their symbolics became different, but their capacity to function as spaces for public debate was radically curtailed because it simply became difficult for people to gather and exercise Republican forms of political authority. In many of these cases, to pick up on what Christoph Markschies just said, it can be very, very difficult to understand the relationship of any given building or something that looks like a building program to problems of agency. And there is a great deal of literature, of course, in other parts of the Mediterranean about how we're to understand this agency. And since Katharina mentioned the problem of epigraphy, of course, one of the most fascinating things about the tradition of so-called building inscriptions, and by here I mean not simply buildings, but even things like roads, is that they often reveal precisely at the moment when they're working to occlude. So, for example, a great deal of the milestones, the vast majority of the milestones of the Roman Empire say something like, you know, Joe Biden, just to pick on our current president, Joe Biden built this. That is to say, Joe Biden's in the nominative, and he is the subject of a transitive verb. And then there will be, in some oblique case, usually an ablative absolute, it will say, you know, Katharina Heyden, you know, took the kura to make sure it happened. And it's perfectly clear then who did the work. And there can be in buildings, of course, a much more elaborate formula, which says a great deal more about agency, which, as I say is always somewhat oblique to the direct statement that the building inscription makes. In any event, my point simply is that the question of agency, the question of local agency as opposed to other voices and so on, is much discussed in the transformation of other cities. This is also, I mean, Jerusalem is also to be situated in an Eastern Mediterranean context, and perhaps in a wider Mediterranean context, in the kind of shift of, I don't know what you want to call it, moneyed interests of the later 2nd and 3rd century, so that there is a tailing off across the entire Eastern Mediterranean in building projects in the later 2nd and early 3rd century, and a substantial rise in the direction of money, or there's what the rich spend their money on shifts from something like building projects in later 2nd and 3rd century towards something like religious foundations. There are all sorts of reasons why we might think this happened. I don't want to get into, as it were, the problem of causation, merely to illustrate the pattern, so that even, you know, probably everyone here has read the inscription for the foundation of the festival of Gaius Julius Demosthenes in Ando, but it's just one of dozens upon dozens upon dozens, which is correlated with a kind of a diminishing of interest in something like, as I say, building projects. And just to return to the fantastic chapter on the rural populations, I will also say that there's here I was fascinated to read this because the problem on which John Seligman concentrates is one for which there's just very fragmentary evidence elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Often in evidence in different locations of very different types. So we know about the incorporation of the pre-Roman Tricastini into the area around Orange because we happen to have this fragments of an inscribed cadastral map. In Saturnia, the evidence for the continued ongoing population of from the Etruscan period into the Roman period is entirely archaeological. There are almost a complete absence of 3rd century sites, suggesting the Romans may have cleared away the population. But when a Roman grid emerges, there are some very large land plots that are kept out of the grid. And Elizabeth Fentress has speculated that these are being used by a prior indigenous elite. In Trieste, we have essentially a single inscription that describes the emergence of an elite in the villages that needs to be incorporated into the city and so forth. So that, in any event, I'll say one last thing about the late antique cityscape. I thought that the material in this chapter on, particularly the material on pilgrimage is great, but I was particularly taken with the discussion, not simply of liturgy, but of the kind of importance of the Jerusalem liturgy for the rest of the late ancient world. I'll simply make one observation about this, which is that the history of liturgy in the late ancient world should probably be understood alongside a couple of important developments in the politics of, or in ceremonial, so in political life, but in particular in ceremonial. I think there is some very fragmentary evidence from 2 or 3 different kinds of source types, that there was a much heightened emphasis in late antiquity, more than earlier, on political groups, city-states in particular, but not always city-states, celebrating the same political ceremonials at the same time, or at least claiming to do it at the same time across the empire. So that in politics, perhaps, as also in religion, there was a desire to overcome the dispersal of the population in space. If we imagine the population here as that of Roman citizens, there was an attempt to overcome the dispersal of the population in space via an insistence on our shared simultaneity in time. And in the absence of Zoom, of course, it didn't actually matter whether, in fact, they were all doing the same thing at the same time, because the reality of simultaneity was invisible. That's an important feature of ideologies of citizenship too, of course, that the actual cultural difference of populations of Roman citizens was utterly invisible. One can only imagine what populations of Roman citizens in Spain would have made of the cuisine of populations of Roman citizens in Palestina. In any event, all of these kinds of things, and I have more on a piece of paper, but I'll let it go. All of these are historical problems that I have wrestled with in other parts of the world, which I think could now be substantially illuminated for myself and for others by reading this volume. I think the case of Jerusalem, which has received such spectacular attention prior and including in your work, could really, the case of Jerusalem can illuminate the work of many other peoples. And simultaneously, it's probably true that further progress in the study of Jerusalem is going to be made by incorporating the insights that people studying all these other cities can bring to your work. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for giving us this broader background and horizon. And last but not least, I would like to invite Konstantin Klein to give us your impressions on the book.
Very much. Good evening. Let me briefly start offering my gratitude to the editors Katharina Heyden and Maria Lissek for inviting me to speak at this occasion. And at the same time, it's an honor and pleasure to be at the Albright Institute, albeit only digitally, but I have very fond memories of many enlightening events and lectures in person at this place, as well as very pleasant conversations in all the years in which I would spend my springtime just a little bit up the hill at the Kenyon Institute. So thank you very much, Matthew, for this great event this evening. When preparing my notes for this short presentation, I realized that this is not an easy task. Well, who who could have guessed so? And obviously some points have already been discussed and raised by the speakers before me. What I try to do within the next 10 minutes is to position Katharina Heyden's and Maria Lissek's new book firstly among some of its predecessors. I would like to call them the parents and grandparents of this book, even though I'm not convinced that this genealogical approach is either appropriate or fitting, because they are technically not related, but still they share some common family members. And secondly, but only for the very end of this brief praise of the volume, I want to ask the very fundamental and seemingly dramatic question, what is this? This beautifully produced and very thick and heavy book that we are celebrating tonight. Very roughly speaking, it seems that every decade produces at least one, but usually two collective volumes on Jerusalem in late antique and early Byzantine times. And having said this, I already need to pause, since the general labels for chronology are, as we all know here, slightly differently used in the Near East and in Europe, let alone the US. This is why this book, which in my opinion is an extremely fruitful product of a collaboration between scholars coming not only from different disciplines, but also from different countries and their respective academic traditions and approaches, is entitled Roman-Byzantine Times, while it in fact incorporates also insightful contributions on early Islamic Jerusalem. I myself just used the terms late antique and early Byzantine because these are the labels to which I'm used to, and others would call the same periods covered by this book simply Byzantine and Islamic, or Byzantine and early Islamic. But eventually these are all labels. These words, they hardly matter as long as a volume sensibly and coherently covers a period which should be, or which has to be, studied together. And this is a trait, I think, which Katharina Heyden's and Maria Lissek's book does achieve in a formidable way, as not only the chapters written by Angelika Neubert and Boaz Shoshan show, but also the many chapters that offer, let's call it cross-sections. For example, Jon Seligman's discussion of the economy of Jerusalem, Hagit Sivan's chapter on the role of Palestinian Judaism, or the contributions by Ora Limor and Boria Biton Ashkeloni on pilgrimage and monasticism, respectively. In their introduction, or preface actually, the editors regret that their book is focused, or slightly more focused, on the history of Christianity, while at the same time, and Katharina Heyden just mentioned that before, there are certain topics that are allegedly not addressed as much as the editors had wished. I think these worries are rather unfounded. So when preparing these thoughts that I present here tonight, I pondered a lot on what could have been missed, ignored, forgotten in this volume. But even after much consideration, I would say that the editors and obviously the contributors did a flawless job. Psalm 122 describes Jerusalem as a city that is closely compacted together, like a strong and stable brick maybe, though etymologically it is rather closely knit together, like a wooden garment. I think this is a very fitting metaphor, not only for the city, but also for this book. The people who worked on it knitted with many needles. They compacted 600 pages of erudition between beautiful blue linen, but despite the many needles and the many hands working on it, this Comes volume commands over a coherent shape and an even pattern. Are there gaps? Certainly, but this is unavoidable. But did the contributors and editors really drop a stitch when closely knitting this book together? I don't think so. Thus, any worries that some threads or strings are missing are, I would say, unfounded. Maybe they are also captatio benevolentia, but what the editors and contributors achieved together is an attractive, evenly produced and very strongly knitted or woven fabric. I certainly do not want to present a history of research here. However, I reckon it is helpful to go back in time, at least for the past 2 decades, if only to prove my point of a decennial regularity with which scholarship on the city of Jerusalem is progressing. I would like to start this with the turn, around the turn of the millennium, even though certainly the important earlier contributions by Edward Hunt or John Binns need to be mentioned, as well as the source collections by Pierre Miraval, by Herbert Donner and John Wilkinson, the archaeological summaries compiled by Klaus Bieberstein and Hans-Wolf Blöthorn, and last but really certainly not least, one book which is now over 40 years old, but in my perception still constitutes one of the most important contributions for the study of the ecclesiastical history of Jerusalem. I refer to Lorenzo Perone's dissertation from 1900, that sounds so old, from 1980, La Chiesa di Palestina e le controversie cristologiche, which is a masterful analysis of the sources, even though I know that Lorenzo Perone is far too modest to admit this. Nowadays, there's also Yaakov Ashkenazi's book, but this is again, because it's in Hebrew, probably not that widely distributed. But obviously having a long chapter written by Lorenzo Perone in this volume here is a fantastic asset for this book, as there are, not to produce jealousy, many other contributions, the building history of the city by Max Kügler, Ute Verstegen's contribution on the sacralisation of Jerusalem, and Nichole Belayche's chapter on the religious life of the city, of which we already heard a glimpse before. Now, I need to be, at least for 1 minute, to be very subjective and go into detail. I think that if everybody just followed Nichole Belayche's reconstruction of the pagan to Christian conversion and location of the capital, of the Temple of Jupiter, of the shrines of Venus or Tyche, as she had first proposed it in 97 and 2001, a lot of paper would have been saved, but then scholarship lives from discussions. So in any case, I think her chapter on the prehistory of Christian Jerusalem in this book is extremely important. To just remain subjective, I immensely profited from reading Harald Buchinger's chapter on the liturgy. Clifford Ando just referred to it as well, not least since in the past years, some rather, I would say, unconvincing things have been written on this subject. Buchinger's chapter, in contrast here, I think, has the potential to replace John Baldwin's thoughts from 30 years ago, which are also a little bit outdated now. But I will come back to this in a minute. The same is obviously true, in my opinion, for Seligman's discussion of the economy. Again, I apologize for being subjective, and I will finish with being subjective after this sentence, but I can just speak for myself here. I think that the chapter on the economy is among the most important contributions in this volume. Firstly, because it is a feat of erudition, but at the same time, because the economy of Palestine and Jerusalem simply is a field from which far too many scholars have shrieked away from. So we have to be very grateful to Seligman for his fantastic work and fantastic summary, and to the editors of the Comus volume for having secured and procured this contribution. Now, it would be tremendously interesting, at least I think so, to know about the motivations of previous editors who compiled, metaphorically speaking, the grandparents and parents of this book here. Some of them we unfortunately cannot ask any longer, while others are luckily still very much active. And last but not least, several of the contributors of the Comus volume had before contributed to its scholarly predecessors. Of course, I speak of Lee Levin's Jerusalem, its sanctity and centrality to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, published in 1999, and in the same year, the late Yoram Zefriya's volume of Sefer Yerushalayim, published in 1999 as well, with Yad Yitzhak Ben Zvi, covering a slightly different period, namely the years 70 to 638. Roughly a decade later, Kafafi and Schick published their Jerusalem Before Islam in 2007, what I think is also a very useful contribution to the field, even though it has perhaps been a bit overshadowed by the more prominent volumes by Levin and Zefriya. My chronology gets a bit mingled now, but if you allow to say that the year 2012 is roughly a decade remote from now, it seems that once more the time felt ripe to strike a balance of research on Jerusalem when again Lee Levin organized a very large conference at Yad Yitzhak Ben Tzvi in Jerusalem, at which many of the people whom I saw in the audience here were also present back then. But I have to confess that I'm not aware whether the proceedings of this conference have been published or are meant to be published. Maybe someone can elucidate me later. Now, is the time ripe for a new collective volume on Roman, Byzantine, early Islamic Jerusalem? Any other answer than a yes would now be probably surprising at this occasion. However, I think we can all agree that we should wholeheartedly say yes, and it has indeed to be a very emphatic, strong and loud yes. The past 10 to 15 years alone have seen very innovative studies on detailed aspects on Jerusalem. I think, for example, Jan-Erik Stepper's work on the Christological controversy of the 5th century, Yoram Zafrias and Lea Dissenni's work on ethnicity, is a long article, and languages in Palestine, Hagit Siwan's book with a distinct new focus on Jewish and Samaritan history in late antiquity. But perhaps more surprisingly, we have also witnessed a tremendous amount of what in German is called Grundlagenforschung, basic research which brought to light a large number of new discoveries that challenged our perception of Jerusalem, both from the epigraphical evidence, obviously I refer to Hannah Cotton's, Walter Ammeling's, Werner X, and so on, epigraphic corpus, but also from archaeology, among them the very recent book on Jerusalem in the 4th century. Nichole has just showed us in her slides by Shlomit Wexler-Abdullah, just as the same scholars' previous work on the late antique city walls actually, or the great study of Georgian and Armenian presence in Jerusalem by Jana Czechanovets. So yes, the time is ripe for a new volume of collaborative research on Jerusalem, and I think Katharina, now I have a TH in your name, I'm sorry, Katharina Heyden and Maria Lissek did an excellent job. What particularly amazed me when reading the volumes is how very much up to date the individual contributions are. I guess this might have been a potential trap for a volume like this, but completely on the contrary, all contributions unanimously really demonstrate that they know their respective material and the most recent state of scholarship. We wouldn't expect anything less, but would have been a potential trap, I guess. So has then the Comus volume rendered its parents and grandparents obsolete? This is a question which we have to emphatically deny. Instead of replacing Levin's Jerusalem or Zafrias Sefer Yerushalayim, this new volume, I think, has really earned its place besides them without undermining their authority. A very happy family if we stay in the metaphor. So as some sort of conclusion, because I promised to touch upon this before, albeit very briefly, what is this Comus volume? Is it a handbook or is it a specialized collective volume? I think it cares to both needs, and it does so in a very harmonical fashion. As I've mentioned before, many of the contributions have the potential to be works of reference for decades to come, which does certainly not mean that others are not, but the ultimate reason which I think that this volume is an excellent book, for which the editors and contributors have to be congratulated, is that it masterfully merges chapters which offer authoritative knowledge with others that in their discussions provide thought-provoking new approaches. For example, Christoph Markschies' chapter on Christianization and urbanization, or really on their interplay. So to conclude, according to Psalm 122, I said before, Jerusalem is a city knitted together like a garment, like a fabric. The same is true for this book. It has colorful individual threads that contributors and editors alike have knitted together in a very appealing, knowledgeable and definitive shape, I wanted to say. And like a garment, its rich material or materials can keep us warm for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your even moving words to the parents that, I don't know, Maria and I, if we call ourselves parents of this book, but thank you also for filling a real gap in the book, which is research history. So there are gaps, and one of them you filled with your speech. So thank you, all of you, and I hand over to Matthew, who will moderate questions, discussion.
Great. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. For those of you out there in the digital world, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and I will read them as they come up and are relevant. In the meantime, I ask our panelists here if any of them have any comments or questions to address anything that has been spoken about so far.
There's also one question by Gerard Finkelstein.
Great. Let's go there first. Gerald Finkelstein. That's a very long question. I will read it very quickly. Hadrian, number one, revived the pagan cults in the cities he visited in the Levant as evidenced by coinage. And number two, logically, after the harsh Jewish revolt of Bar Kokhba, declared a sort of damnatio memoriae of Judah by changing the name of the province to that of Syria-Palestina. Is it understood that he buried under a massive volume of debris the location of Golgotha and the nearby temporary tomb of Jesus, then set on it the largest Roman temple in Aelia Capitolina in order also to erase the most revered place by the Christians and suppress their inconvenient religion? This is open to anybody who wishes to comment.
Maybe I could say a word. First, hi, Gerald. Yes, of course, what you say is what have been said and repeated by the Christian tradition, and as soon as Eusebius of Caesarea, this tradition of the Romans wanted to occult traces of Jesus. Yet this ideology, this discourse is very difficult to prove on the ground first, and I would say to prove in the context of the Hadrian policy, because even if Hadrian had confirmed the Trajan's edict, you know quite well, that is reported in the response, the reply to the letter of Pliny. So even if Hadrian confirmed the Trajanus position on the fact that the name of Christian could be itself delictual, we do not see in his policy any way, any action precisely against Christians. So it's very difficult to assert this very old hypotheses that have been reported during many times. At least I do not see any solid argument in order to prove it or to support it.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? That was a pretty good answer.
Yeah, can I mean, I don't have anything specific to say about the tomb of Jesus. All questions about Jesus can be directed to Nichole. The metaphorical use of the term damnatio memoriae is is actually useful in this context, because of course, as I think is now very well understood, the importance of damnatio memoriae was not to effect an erasure, which was probably in any event impossible. The point of it was to publicly condemn. And the memory of the past era, the traces of the past, had to remain visible in order for that act of kind of condemning to be politically meaningful. So for example, the chiseling out of the name rather than the replacement of the inscription was the way to go, because you wanted everyone to know that you weren't erasing the memory, you were condemning the memory of the past. In that sense, oh darn, there's a very fine, there's a contemporary anthropologist, Hausig, was it? Who said about such things that, he said it was a phrase he used about the secret. The secret is the thing that everyone knows that we must profess to have forgotten. So I also say that the reason I speak at such length about it is because, of course, there are many Roman colonies in which we know something about the relationship of the religious landscape of the Roman colony to the past. This is true in a non-religious sense because Roman colonies frequently had as part of their official name, the name of the indigenous population whom they had usually somewhat displaced, but also incorporated. In that sense, the Roman colony itself preserved the indigenous past. It wasn't, as it were, they didn't pretend the foundation was de novo, was ex nihilo, it was de novo. And second, across a vast array of epigraphic evidence, it's perfectly clear that the prior cults were very often incorporated. I mean, in that sense, the situation of Jerusalem is special. In that sense, it would be useful to, for somebody to set an array. I mean, for example, we have from 1999, what I would think is a feriala, what John Scheid and Lilian Enabli call a lexapra from Carthage, in which we can say something about the 2nd century continuation of cults from Carthage, but you can do it from a million Roman colonies. As I say, the main point is I want to affirm something about the question which may not have been intended, about the continued visibility of the past and the present in virtually all Roman colonial foundations.
Great, thank you.
May I add also a very short sentence? If we are looking to other traces, archaeological visible traces of Christianity in those times, the question, what was visible at the Circus Vaticanus? These were extremely simple and not visible things to public. And so the idea that there was something to destroy it or to cover it, that's the wishful thinking of Christians looking back to their past. When standing under the Church of Redeemer in Jerusalem and looking to the whole platform, you got the impression for real serious destruction of serious visible remains. That was, as I said, wishful thinking of Christians which had the idea that the past was greater than what, if one is allowed to use the term, really happened.
If I may add 2 words, at the same time for Cliff, after Cliff and after Christoph, first, this notion of memory and of abolitio, historiography at the same time for locating the Jupiter or Capitoline Triad temple on the Temple Mount, with exactly the same kind of reasoning in order to eradicate Judaism in one case, Christianity in another one. And just for following on Christoph, the lonely clue we have of the conscience of the place of the death of Jesus or of his tomb, either the passion of the tomb, comes back to Melito of Sardis, who visited the city in the middle of the 2nd century, so after Hadrian, and he just says that the place of the tomb was in the middle of the colonnaded street. That is one of the two cardinals, since there was two cardinals. This is the only first dated information about the Christian conscience of, let us say, the topography of Jesus. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very good point. Okay, I think we can end it there. Congratulations on this wonderful book. A lot of great feedback. I've linked in the chat links to purchase your own copy of the book, so everyone should please do that if you're interested. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good night, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having us. Goodbye.
Thank you for inviting us, and lovely evening in Jerusalem and Bern,
Thank you.
Paris,
Bern,
Bamberg,
Bamberg,
Tel Aviv.
Chicago.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.